What do you hope for? What do you see in 2030? What gives you optimism and what keeps you up at night?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I think what I want us to see, or what my hope is, I think within our space, our niche, of these smaller aircraft operators, we want that to be the spearhead. I think leading sustainability within aviation more broadly.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, alongside Renee Velasquez. And today we're thrilled to have Kennedy Ricci, president of 4Air, joining us. Kennedy, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And before we dive into this week's topics and stories, I'd love to introduce you to our audience. So I'd love if you could start by sharing a bit about your background and your current role at 4Air and what you're working on at 4Air.
Yeah, thank you, Renee, for having me on the show. So my name is Kennedy. I'm the president at 4Air. We launched the business about 5 years ago, looking at how to build solutions around sustainability in aviation specifically. We noticed that there's not a lot of good solutions out there, and we looked at how to decarbonize an aviation operation. And the goal was how do you decouple the growth of industry, the growth of an aircraft operator from the growth of its emissions. So I'm a pilot myself. I've been flying for about 6 years, and so this was a personal endeavor for me as much as a professional one. But how do we reduce our impact from aviation? So we're involved around offsets, sustainable fuels, new fuels, alternative propulsion technologies, non-CO2 measurement and mitigation. We really take a comprehensive view on sustainability in aviation and try to develop solutions, make it accessible for people.
Topic number one around clean cook stoves being at a crossroads, right? In regards to the voluntary market and Corsia, cook stove credits have had a few rough years. There's been integrity concerns, allegations of overstated emission savings, and many buyers losing confidence in the cook stove market. But right now, we're seeing a potential turnaround for the sector thanks to new quality labels and demand from programs like Corsia, right? So the ICVCM recently approved 3 clean cooking methodologies under its stringent core carbon principle label. And in March of this 2025, both Gold Standard and Vera had their updated cook stove methodologies accepted as CCP compliant. And this is a big deal because it's the first time cook stove credits are being recognized as high integrity by a new global benchmark, right? And with regards to Corsia eligibility, these credits are expected to meet Corsia's phase 1 requirements. And Corsia has tightened its rules for offsets. Credits must come from programs that meet certain criteria. So cook stove projects might soon supply Corsia compliant offsets, and the sector will roughly need 100 to 150 million tons of offsets for its first phase. So cook stoves are shaping up to be one of the major supply sources to fill that demand. So, with this regard, from your perspective, now how significant do you think the core carbon principle and Corsia eligibility is for restoring trust in cook stove credits? And do you think that the stamp of approval by the ICVCM will bring, mainstream buyers back to this category? Would love to hear your first initial thoughts on, cook stove credits within Corsia.
Yeah. Yeah, I think both labels are going to be important, but slightly in slightly different ways. So under our program, we deal with a lot of aviation specific buyers. So Corsia is going to carry, I think, an important regulatory stamp of approval, but also a known aviation related benchmark that people will trust and want to use as a validation, I think, of the credits that they're using. We see that emerging within SAF as well. Not so much yet, I think, as the EU has had more of a focus. So ICC EU or EU certification labels have been really important on the SAF side. But on the carbon side, CORSIA has really emerged, I think, as that default stamp of approval within the aviation space. But what we do is, we see, we'll work with customers. We build like a standard carbon offset portfolio, but oftentimes we're working with them to curate something more specific. And we see cook stoves always emerge as something that is attractive to our customers because of the co-benefits usually associated with those projects. And many times, kind of when we're outside of the CORSIA label, our customers are relying on us as we make choices about what projects we use in our portfolio. And it's really important for us to maintain that trust of the projects that we're using, monitoring for potential issues, making sure that they're of the highest in integrity. And so I think that CCP label, while maybe not as known widely, I think within the aviation space, is an important one to us because we see the importance that cook stove projects have in general with our customers. And I think we see that, trend continuing. So the opportunity to, qualify for CORSIA or have that label, I think is an extra stamp of approval will go a long way in making people feel comfortable with those types of projects. We know that they're going to be important. And CORSIA, we're seeing really start to drive a lot of, I think, current kind of forward-looking demand expectations around the industry in general, and driving a certain sector or part of the carbon market to quite higher of CORSIA eligible projects versus none. And I'm interested to see, as that demand expectation translates into demand realization, what does pricing kind of go from there? And especially between, that CORSIA label, if that becomes a almost default expectation because you want to be able to access those higher prices.
Yeah, yeah, certainly, certainly. Renee, did you want to jump in here with any opinions on cook
Yeah,
stoves underneath CORSIA?
yeah, sure. I'd love to. And Kennedy, thanks again for joining. And really grateful for your expertise, your subject matter expertise with regards to aviation. I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think it's great to see, firstly, supply starting to emerge on the horizon for CORSIA. I think it's obviously such a huge demand signal for our market, but it's been very limited with regards to actual supply coming on. We're limited right now in terms of just the jurisdictional red credits that are coming in from our trees as eligible emission units under CORSIA. And so it's not created a market per se. It's been very few airlines that have actually started to inquire in this market and start to transact. And it's due to a lack of supply. But when we look at the forecasts and we look at the demand materializing across the compliance years, right? And we're halfway through the compliance window in phase one. I think it's the realization is really dawning on the liable entities, the airlines, that they need to start to procure the supply. So anyway, it's back to the cook stoves. I think essentially most of the airlines will be agnostic around the project type. They'll certainly be sensitive with regards to pricing, and they'll be very, very sensitive with regards to ensuring that they are securing eligible emission units under CORSIA. So having that CORSIA flag within the registry is really key. As far as cook stoves are involved here for CORSIA, it's a key area of potential supply. So very, very keen to see more and more of those credits come online, specifically with the corresponding adjustment to enable them to become eligible emission units under CORSIA. So I'd say that. In terms of the ICVCM side, I think it's great to see these methodologies really now starting to gain that traction. I think what will end up happening, and the reason that we haven't seen a lot of corporate sort of demand broadly in the market is just that there's this perception that there's an oversupply and there's really not an urgency with regards to corporates on the voluntary market. Just it's kind of continuous. The market isn't growing at a rapid rate, but it's also not, it hasn't decreased significantly year over year. In fact, it's growing at a reasonably sort of conservative clip of 5 to 7% per annum. But there has been some overhang with regards to supply. So there's no urgency really for the corporates. It'll take something like CORSIA to really create a huge swing in the market with regards to demand, to then create that impetus and that urgency for corporates to really kind of come on board. But what I
Mhm.
do think will happen is that inevitably, as voluntary market demand returns, and it will return in earnest over the next 5 years, mark my words, there will be a directional trade with regards to a preference for ICVCM, CCP eligible units. I think that there's a clear
Yeah.
delineation in the market, those that have the CCP and those that won't. And those, I believe, will term as stranded assets, essentially.
Yeah.
So great to see
Yeah. Thanks for
Surf
your
Earth kind of moving to
perspective
the
on
right
that.
direction. Yeah, pleasure.
Yeah, certainly. And from another angle, obviously Corsia allows various project types, reforestation, renewables. But do you have a sense, like airlines, do you sense airlines have a preference for cook stoves or other certain types of projects because of cost and volume, or are they wary and is are they looking at alternatives like sustainable aviation fuel certificates or carbon removals to help meet their goals, right? Because there are a lot of different aspects that go into aviation decarbonization, and Corsia is just one, but um, SAF being another efficiency. I mean, you could kind of speak to this, but yeah, that I wanted to ask if they are, if they have a preference, or do you sense that there is preferences for certain project types versus another, and then versus, energy attribute certificates like SAF and etc. Maybe touch on this from your perspective.
Kennedy, do you want to take this
I
one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you alluded to, I think, an important distinction there on kind of the voluntary versus, regulatory demand, I think. And on that regulatory side, I think we see this emerging with SAF as well, is, yeah, what's my cheapest cost to comply? Well, what's going to be the most cost-effective CORSIA compliant credit? That's going to dominate airline demand for sure. And then the, business aviation, so the space we deal in is a kind of subset of commercial aviation. We're targeting smaller aircraft operators. They maybe have 2 or 3 airplanes in their fleet. We usually don't work with aircraft bigger than 19 seats. So we're about 2% of the overall aviation footprint is kind of what we call the term business aviation. But that's our niche spot that we focus on. And that operator is usually what underneath the CORSIA thresholds for having to comply. Now they'll trigger the EU ETS ones a little bit more frequently, given that they're lower, but the CORSIA ones were set somewhat intentionally to try to reduce the compliance burden on some of these smaller operators, though we do deal with ones that do end up triggering the threshold and have to look at how they comply with that. So for the compliance kind of sliver, I think of the CORSIA market in our space, that certainly will be kind of a cost look at it. But so many of our operators are also looking at what do they want their voluntary program to look like. So our, 4Air has 4 levels, and what we try to do is make it very accessible for customers to be sustainable. So tell us what level you want to be, what aircraft you're flying, we take care of all of the rest. So we'll help you build the carbon offset program. The beginning of our program is carbon neutrality. So we say it's very, it's possible to go to 100% carbon neutrality today. Let's do that. And then the higher levels are looking at how we do that. So today, level 1's with offsets. Level 3 is with sustainable aviation fuel. Level 4 is looking at alternative propulsion, funding, research on electric and hydrogen aviation. But so the point of that is when an operator is under our program, they're already looking at how do I offset everything? And so we usually look at is what's CORSIA compliant out there that fits into your kind of core offsetting strategy. And that's where we see a little bit more attention, I think, in what projects they use, pickiness about what projects they use, because they want to promote this as part of their program, and they want to be able to speak to the co-benefits around a project or where the project is located. I think that one actually emerges probably most frequently as the core concern for somebody or core interest for somebody is, can I find a project that's local? If I'm a European-based operator, I want to find something in or near Europe. US, same thing. So we see, a lot of, we do preference and attention to the types of projects, where they're stored, that go into our customers' portfolios. And we'll look at making sure a portion, of that is CORSIA compliant to meet their CORSIA, regulatory requirements. And I think we'll also see that emerge as kind of that stamp of approval that just says, okay, that's, I want my portfolio to be 100%, CORSIA. I think we'll see that emerge as kind of a threshold regulatory side. We see that with SAF too. People just want to know that they're in compliance with the fuel data to fuel supplier level. But on the voluntary side, when people be to where are those products, what are the types of technologies, what are those other quote benefits and labels to speak to as well.
So, Kennedy, as a second Trump administration could reshape U.S. aviation climate policy. And while the U.S. remained in Corsia during Trump's first term, renewed skepticism and toward international climate commitments, and plus rollbacks on sustainability programs like the SAF tax credit, now raise questions about potential policy impacts on the SAF market and Corsia, aviation decarbonization as a whole. And we know that you work with clients across the world in different jurisdictions that have a lot different policies that impact their forward-looking incentives. So I would love to hear your thoughts on just the policy impacts that you're seeing in the U.S. versus the EU, and if anything is materializing and significantly impacting SAF market growth or overall just aviation decarbonization here in the U.S. There's a lot to unpack there, so I would you could take it whichever angle that you'd like.
Yeah, so I think, going into 2025, there was a lot of uncertainty about where kind of policy in general was going to go. And there's a lot of question thinking about reversing of policy. I think we saw the concerns originally about would the IRA be repealed in its entirety. Now we finally gotten a little bit more clarity, obviously just this past week with the bill being passed and signed, that of how the framework will look going forward. But I think what we've seen more generally is just a fractionalization, I think, in the approaches of a kind of harmonized policy. So for a while there, I think we had a pretty well-defined international uh, regulatory approach through Corsia. We had EU ETS, but that had been restricted to just within Europe as a result of Corsia being implemented. But now what we're seeing is a little bit less kind of harmonization, I think, in this global approach. So Europe and even the states within it are advancing kind of their own policy now that affects aviation in different ways. And we're seeing, instead of kind of a federal alignment on what SAF policy will be, the states picking up the slack, but obviously in different ways. So we have LCF programs in some states, we have SAF production credits and use credits in others. We've got general investment credits and others. And so you've seen just a total, I think, divergence of kind of state policy that has made the operating environment quite more complicated. So where you will build a SAF plant versus source your feedstock versus deliver your SAF versus claim the credits, might be 4 different jurisdictions now because of the way that the tax policy, I think, that's emerged. And so I think there's still a lot of opportunity out there, I think, which has been the positive. We're still seeing SAF volumes continue upward, both from a voluntary and regulatory space. There's certainly been some, I think, examples of people reducing their sustainability budgets, but for the most part, we haven't seen any customers cancel their commitments, and we've still seen that people understand there's importance to this, both on the voluntary perspective, and then within Europe, there SAF mandates starting this year. Within the UK, the same. That regulated market, I think, has helped form a nice core demand that's continuing to help both SAF investment and SAF offtake. What we're seeing though is just really a complication, I think, of trying to operate in airspace, and that's almost been more of a challenge, I think, looking forward, because how you comply with the different policies around SAF, how you maximize the credit values of those, what that'll do, I think, to shifting trade flows. We'll have some pretty impressive impacts that I don't think have fully played out yet. There's good things within the bill of the extension of the credit. There's things that around like the feedstock limitations that I think we'll see how that really impacts costs. It'll certainly affect feedstock flows. Things like ILUC will change the preference for what SAF does. It'll diverge us from Corsia a little bit more. So you might see the emergence of more, US specific SAF and Corsia non-compliant SAF. So a lot of questions, I think, still remain of how it exactly will play out. But that general trend, I think, of how do we comply, how do we maximize the value of SAF, is one that has continued, I think, to be of prime importance for our customers, and something that we're seeing keeping us busier than ever is how do we maximize kind of the regulatory value of SAF. One of the other things we look at in our space is we're able to use book and claim. So within business aviation, this might be a concept people aren't as familiar with, but if you think about renewable electricity, right, you have an option to build a wind farm at your facility, and that would be one way of using renewable electricity. Or you can pay your power provider to input enough renewable electricity credits into the grid overall, and that displaces the fossil-based electrons you need or pull out of that grid. Within SAF, we look at something very similar where we don't need to deliver the fuel directly into the aircraft, because if I'm producing it in one country but want to claim it or use it in another, that can be very expensive and you lose some of the carbon benefit if you're shipping that, to new airports. So book and claim allows us to put the SAF into an airport close to where it's produced, saves cost, saves carbon, and then allows customers to voluntarily claim that fuel by saying that they're displacing, the amount of fossil jet that they're using. So we've been pushing for a long time that we should be able to do this on the regulatory perspective, because it'll help, make the supply chain for SAF more efficient as well. But for now, it's just on a voluntary level, and that opens up a lot of opportunity about where SAF gets placed and how it can be claimed, especially as these tax credits, are really going to maybe change the physical supply chain. Book and claim is probably going to keep part of that flexible, or at least hopefully will be.
Yeah, certainly. And the booking claim, yeah, Renee, I'll let you jump in
No,
here.
I was just going to say thank you for that masterclass. Like that, I want to double click on a number of things that you just said, Ken. Right, but on book and claim, I think the last thing you just highlighted was essentially the innovation that occurs within voluntary markets that then can ultimately flow back into compliance systems. So that's one thing I just want to kind of reiterate and stress. And I do really love that kind of comparison to REX, for example, right, and other environmental attributes, where you can decouple the physical from the actual certificate itself, so that it can create essentially a global market, right, or regional or national, right, but essentially fungible instruments that can then be traded, that decouples it from the physical molecule making its way logistically from the feedstock into the pump effectively. And I think it's a really great way to help SAF to scale. Can I go back a little bit to get some context on some of the things that you said? Like the most pressing, I think, compliance signal, correct me if I'm wrong here, right? Because I do not purport to be a SAF expert, and you are, and that's why you're on this podcast. But it's the Refuel EU mandate effectively here. And I really want to get sort of some context around, that system. What is that mandate? How does it scale over time? And ultimately, how does it evolve? It's got some interesting quirks around tankering and some other stuff. But can you give us sort of an overview about Refuel EU, and then let's just kind of go down that pathway around implications. And then the final thing around this question is multi-headed, so apologies. But you talked about limitations, or like rate limiting steps within the supply side. There are some real concerns around certain feedstocks and their viability in the market. And I suspect you'll talk about this, but as the compliance signals ramp up over time, we'll start to see more and more strain being put on the supply side. So can you just help us unpack all of that?
Yes. Yeah, we could go for probably a few hours, I think, on Refuel EU, but in high level summary, so what it is it's a blending mandate for fuel suppliers. So there's a lot of confusion sometimes about it being an aircraft operator or an airline end mandate, and it's actually not. So there's no obligation as an airline to use SAF under Refuel EU. There's an obligation for the fuel supplier to supply you SAF under Refuel EU. And we won't get too complicated about where it applies and things like that, but generally it's a blending mandate. And it's actually very similar to the way, within the US, we have a blending, mandate around ethanol, but that's now been implemented in the same form within the UK. It's at that fuel supplier level. What it does introduce as an airline level obligation is to reduce tankering. And so this is a somewhat common practice in the space of just, you don't always fill up at the airport before you take off for the next flight. Sometimes you take enough fuel at the last airport for the next one. And so that's called tankering, and you might do it for economic reasons. Same thing, you might fill up on gasoline when you pass a gas, pump or a gas station with cheap gasoline. You're going to fill up and you're going to try to maximize that, even though you maybe don't need all of that gas for a while. Same idea here. You're going to fuel up where it's cheaper so that you've got cheaper gas in your tank. You might do it because of slotting requirements. It's hard to get fuel sometimes at airports. Some airports are small. They don't want you filling up every single time. So they've got other reasons around just logistics and operations why you might not fuel up every single time. But there was a requirement under Refuel EU that was intended to reduce tankering because you do pay a fuel penalty when you're carrying extra fuel around. So you're burning fuel for the purpose of carrying other fuel. And so in an effort to limit some of that economic tankering and some of that kind of carbon impact, there was a requirement introduced where you have to uplift 90% of the fuel you need for the next flight at the point of departure. And I think a lot of the industry, frankly, kind of missed that requirement as we looked at Refuel EU in general. And that's emerged as, I think, quite a difficult mandate or requirement to comply with. There are exemptions for certain routes or certain flights that are short enough, but getting access to those exemptions, claiming them, has proved quite difficult in practice. So we're seeing potential fees ramp up that I don't think the industry was quite ready for. We're also seeing quite expensive penalties emerge. In some cases, the minimum is 2 times the price of fuel for what you didn't uplift at the point of departure. So you're already paying double
that's
the price
punitive.
of fuel. And in some countries, are talking about a penalty 10 times the price of fuel, which is just exorbitant at some point. And so the industry, we don't really have a chance, I think, to change this for the next few years. But trying to go back and educate, that we need to make it much easier to make exemptions, because a lot of times it's not so much that we want to tanker the fuel, but the airports don't want us to uplift fuel. It's hard to get fuel to a lot of these airports. They don't have a lot to go around necessarily. They need to prioritize the airlines in many cases. So there's a lot of cases, both airlines and business aviation, where the tankering requirements have been difficult. And I think the spirit of them was that we don't want people to tanker fuel to avoid the SAF, what will be higher priced SAF blended fuel within Europe. And so I think it's thinking about what are the other ways that we could enforce that same benefit without maybe having the same the tankering or penalty requirement that the way that we've done it so far. So can you buy SAF elsewhere to compensate for what you didn't uplift at that or what you ended up tankering? There's probably other mechanisms for how we can achieve that. I think the goal was good, but this is one of the things about in practice, how do we make this actually more practical? On the feedstock side, I think that's a really critical one, because what we don't want to happen is, there's already, I think, concerns around biofuels. There's always concerns around food and fuel, competing. In many cases, they don't. In many cases, they can be complementary. But that perceived perception, I think, of where SAF is coming from is really important for public acceptance and understanding of SAF as a viable decarbonization tool for aviation. And from all the work we've done on electric and hydrogen, those are great solutions, but they're far down the road. And even if they emerge successfully in the next, 10, 20 years, they don't really get to the bulk of aviation emissions, which are long haul flights. SAF is that key decarbonization tool for those long haul flights, and making sure that
So what are the
people
pathways
trust those
right
kind
now
of
that are
things
the
is
most? No, cool. Sorry to interrupt, but so just a question there. Obviously, it begs the question: what are the sort of the most scalable pathways right now to generating SAF? Right, because and you mentioned like these other technologies, they're really in the infancy, and they just lack the kind of the physics kind of test right now in terms of the power to weight ratios that are required, like in terms of the fuel density. They just don't match it for commercial aviation. Certainly, maybe for some pilot type of things, sure, and lightweight aircrafts. But for commercial aviation, not so much. So what are the kind of the most common types of SAF in the market today? And what are those feedstocks?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you make a good point there about alternative fuels. So, energy density is the primary issue there. Aviation, we use 2 primary fuel types. So one is jet kerosene, most jet engines, that's the most common one. Another one is an aviation gasoline. That's mostly the lighter end aircraft, single engine propeller aircraft that are using it. That we don't really have a sustainable alternative for. And I think that's where we're seeing electrification probably most promising, is that small general aviation training market that will get electrified, and that will be cheaper to operate. That will be a phenomenal, I think, tool there. But the other end, SAF is really key for us. Today, we're seeing used cooking oil and waste animal fats as the primary sources. We're starting to see, especially within the US, the emergence of more soybean oil, distilled corn oil as used for feedstocks. But I think what's most, when we look at scalability, there's no single feedstock, I think, that can meet all of aviation's demand, or one that we necessarily want to, because we don't want to place strains, I think, in any single feedstock source. Waste-based, feedstocks can maybe only get us so far, and so we need to fill, what we can from that. So please eat your French fries, because that waste cooking oil, we need it for jet fuel. So you're doing your part there when you have your French fries. But beyond that, we need, waste biomass. So agricultural waste, woody waste, and then synthetic fuels, all kind of playing, a part of the feedstock pie, I think, that we're going to pull from. One of the key scalability, I think, tools that we look at, though, is what can we use of existing infrastructure that's already out there? So a lot of these pathways can be used what's called co-processing. And basically, you just take a kind of sustainable feedstock. You might have to pre-treat it a little bit, but then you can run it alongside crude oil through a traditional refinery, and you've displaced a little bit of the fossil crude with a green-based, bio-crude or green feedstock there, a more circular carbon feedstock. That is way cheaper for us to get going, because you don't have to build a $2 billion refinery. You're able to use one that already exists and just process materials through it. So I think we'll see more focus on how do we, co-process feedstocks, because it's going to be very scalable from a capital perspective about how much we need to physically build. We can reuse what's already there and make SAF that way, as well as, diesel, marine fuel, plastics, gasoline. All of those products can be now produced from a green feedstock through co-processing.
So thank you for that. That's again, thank you for that context. So
Yeah.
Question. So basically, I think what you've outlined is that, and I've heard this acronym lots of times, and carbon markets are an acronym soup, right? But it's basically the HEFA. So it's hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, and you mentioned used cooking oils and animal fats and other sort of waste oils, and but you also just highlighted, right? Like it's depending really on a limited pool of these waste oils and fats, which are already effectively, correct me if I'm wrong here, but they're stretched thin from demand for, like you said, renewable diesel and maybe other industries like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, other industrials that might look for that. So I've heard, when I talk to a lot of airline clients that that are focused on SAF, that it's tricky, because essentially there's the supply constraint. They're saying, we're running out of feedstocks for the HEFA pathways. What are some of the other pathways, and how far along are they in comparison? So I've heard of power to liquid and alcohol to jet and other types of SAF sort of supply pathways or feedstocks. And then I want to kind of dive into more of the kind of the fundamentals of the market. It seems to be growing, and obviously we talked about the refuel mandate, that and other compliance systems, as well as voluntary demand. We see a lot of airlines making commitments around the SAF quotient. The demand seems to be there, right? But I'm just concerned around how does the industry sustain the current demand and growth rate, because it's growing at a CAGR of like 100% per annum over the last couple of years. How is that sustained, and how can that be sustained in order to reach these huge kind of commitments? I think refuel was like, it's at 2% of all 2%. Jet fuel in the EU must be SAF this year, right? 2025.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, and then it ramps up to like what, 6% or something by 2030.
6% by 2030, and then up to 70% by 2050.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really ambitious, right? When you look at sustainability reports for airlines, and we speak to many of them, they're in the 0.1 to 0.7, maybe a 1 and a bit % in terms of total SAF. And many of them are saying, well, yeah, the economics don't stack up, but it's also really hard to secure that supply unless you are Delta, United, and maybe like Lufthansa Group, and maybe like British Airways, or one of these big groups. Like it's kind of hard to secure that supply in terms of on an offtake basis. So anyway, big kind of lot of context there. But what are the other types of SAF, and then can we like go into the kind of future of that market?
Yeah,
I'd love to unpack that with you.
So I think everything we look at is kind of, what are the other feedstocks? Because I think what's been impressive is there's been a very ambitious look at what can we turn into SAF, and everything from the waste cook oil, waste and used cooking oils that we have today, industrial off gases, synthesizing carbon and hydrogen directly into SAF. That's kind of the PTL pathway. How do we capture carbon out of the atmosphere and then turn it back into jet fuel for a very easy circular pathway? Bio-based ones like agricultural waste biomass, woody waste biomass, some crop-based, rounds around alcohol to jet, ethanol to jet, to the ones that are kind of, really interesting out there, that even construction waste, municipal waste, and even, what we call municipal solid waste, so landfill, to municipal wet waste, which is more like human waste, all as sources of carbon that can be turned back into jet fuel. So there's I think, a very broad look in the industry right now of what's going to, all these different technologies, what can be really scaled up, what will be an effective way to produce SAF down the road. And probably what you'll end up seeing, I think, is a regionalization of different SAF pathways. So some are going to make, a lot of sense in certain regions of the world with access to that feedstock and easy supply chains. And other technologies will make sense elsewhere. So things like power to liquid will probably make the most amount of sense in the Middle East, where you have a lot of solar accessibility at cheap cost. Other areas with high biomass, like the Nordics, are probably going to use waste woody biomass as a source. So I actually think we'll end up seeing different regions with different SAF pathways and technologies over the long term, because nothing, will single-handedly, I think, be kind of a dominant source, at least for the next, 10, 20 years, as we have to rise the supply to meet these mandates. The industry has been growing, impressively. I think we've doubled or tripled each year the last 2 or 3 years. So that ramp up in supply has been quite aggressive. I think we've passed about 500 million gallons of SAF available globally. Now, the industry uses 80 billion gallons globally, so we're still less than, a percent of global consumption. But to go from a few tens of millions of gallons kind of in 2019, 2020 to 500 million shows you the ramp up of supply that's been available. What I think will be interesting, longer term, I think we've always had this theory that we see a price convergence, I think, around carbon abatement in general within aviation. So offsets, were kind of the cheaper option today. I think as we move to more CORSIA eligible projects, as we move to higher requirements, I think we're seeing that price, move up $10, $20 a metric ton. At the same time, price, of SAF has been around $700 a metric ton of carbon reduced. That's fallen now to maybe $200, $300 a metric ton of carbon reduced. And then we also, DAC, or, some of the more carbon removal technologies are in that $100 to $300, metric ton range as well. So we're seeing, all three of these kind of pathways converge a little bit. And I think it'll be interesting to see how people value or place premiums, I think, on those different approaches. So, we have a lot of conversations with people in our space that said, okay, if I wanted to carbon offset my entire aircraft or my fleet, I can do it at a much cheaper cost than SAF, and it's the same carbon, reduced. So why am I going to fund that into SAF? But as SAF has gotten cheaper, we're seeing more of okay, I want to fund something that's in sector. I want something that's going to be within aviation, help decarbonize the industry directly. And I think we'll be interested to see if that view of something in sector versus outside, or how removals plays into that, and certainly how regulation might affect removals, under EU ETS and other programs, will affect maybe people's selection of offsets, removals, and SAF as a solution for an aircraft operator.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you for, this great, masterclass. I think it's really great to hear your insights. But touching on, obviously, I think SAF certificates are one of the key ways to scale up the physical SAF market and have that long-term market signal for demand, providing early demand and pricing signals that justifies investments, the efficiency and equity, avoiding logistical challenges and allowing broader participation, and corporates being able to, collaborate with the aviation industry and basically cover that green premium on the SAF to help scale the market. A lot of folks are saying how similar to what the REC market was for renewable energy technologies in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and how that scaled. They see SAF-C as the next the scope 3 market for SAF, right? Because corporates can claim it's an in-setting tool for corporates for their travel emissions, right? But right now, the SAF-C space is still in its infancy, and it's highly fragmented, right? There's no universal registry or standard there's multiple platforms, from airlines to independent firms. There's obviously varying methodologies, and that raises concerns around double counting and inconsistent carbon accounting and credibility gaps. So, yeah, and I know this is something that 4Air addresses with systems like the Assure registry, right? So I would love for you to touch on the book and claim SAF system through Assure, and maybe give an overview and touch on some of the points I mentioned about market fragmentation and how this kind of addresses that, because I think we didn't have a chance to touch on Assure yet. So would love
Yeah.
to hear about this.
Yeah, so we launched Assure, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, when we started to see that there wasn't a good book and claim platform, that targeted business aviation a little bit more. We saw, our industry is a lot more fragmented than commercial aviation in general. So we're using smaller amounts of fuel, smaller quantities of fuel, and we service about 10 times the number of airports that commercial aviation does. So around, the US, I think it's about 500 airports have commercial aviation service. We'll fly into about 5,000 airports. So there's just a much bigger logistical challenge to get SAF to every airport that we fly in if you were to physically uplift it elsewhere. And so that's why book and claim, I think, plays a little bit bigger role in our space. And also because the quantities or the batch sizes that you make SAF in might fully go to one airline as one batch, but within business aviation, we're taking hundreds of gallons of fuel at a time. So you have to split up these batches, to small fragments. And as we talked about, I think there'll be an importance as people value, and it's important to track how much carbon in my batch of fuel actually reduced. What was its life cycle emissions? So that's where we developed Assure to help track what was a more difficult supply chain accounting within the business aviation space. And so, a key part of that is book and claim. So, how do we make sure that we can maximize the carbon benefit of SAF, keep it close to the producer, but still track, appropriately through the supply chain? As we're dividing it up between aircraft operators, we want to make sure that if your aircraft, took 100 gallons of this batch, but then the next aircraft operator took 100 gallons, that the mass balance accounting of which fuel actually went to which party, is appropriately followed, and you're not double buying environmental credits, so there's no double counting of who actually had ownership of specific ones. So our goal was we actually tokenize on a private blockchain the gram of fuel. And so we take a batch, we divide it into grams so that we can convert into whatever units you wanted to see as an user, because part of our other issue is we deal with international operators and you're buying fuel in gallons and pounds and kilograms and cubic meters and liters, and you need to normalize your SAF purchases as well as your fuel purchases across all of these different metrics. So getting very granular with our accounting was an important piece of it too. But ultimately, I think, like you said, how does the SAF-C market play into that? And we get into kind of scope 1 versus scope 3 accounting. So most corporates, as they're flying on an airline, that's their scope 3 business travel. In our space, when they have a corporate aircraft, that's oftentimes their scope 1 emission. And so we've seen an important ability to track as a corporate, if you have an aircraft as part of your fleet, both the scope 1 reductions and the scope 3, and trying to make sure we align, the scope 3 side with the airline usage and the scope 1 side with just the business aviation usage, and not to kind of cross those. And I think one of the key things that this market's waiting for is really just clarity from GHGP or SBTI about how are we going to be able to account for, SAF-C as part of our scope 3 kind of emission reductions, and what are going to be the requirements, I think, around that. Because we've seen, I think, most fragmented approaches around how flexible are we with the scope 3 credits? Do you need a tie as, corporate A to be a pre-existing customer of airline A to be able to claim emission reductions on that airline? Or can you buy scope 3s from any airline? As long as it's appropriately tracked, can it be completely decoupled from the airline's, core customer base at all? And I think those are the questions that we've tried to be a close eye onto, try to keep a value chain kind of alignment between. So we've been a little more conservative about how you account for scope 3s and what that looks like, because we don't want to get to a situation where GHP comes out and says, hey, you can't fully decouple scope 1s and scope 3s like the industry is doing, and that invalidates, emission reductions that might have been claimed in the past. Most likely anything they do will be prospective, but we still want to be cautious to think about how we account for this, keep a value chain alignment to the underlying relationship between the parties, but ultimately having transparency to what are you buying? Because that's something I think critical within SAF is when people are saying, I want to buy SAF. Well, do you want the physical fuel? Do you want just the fuel attributes? Do you want scope 1 attributes? Do you want scope 3? Do you want scope 1 and scope 3? The potential products, I think, essentially off of a SAF gallon of SAF are a lot more than a typical ton of carbon. And so that's where this accounting is really important, that you can keep that differentiation between what scope 1, scope 3, and have a good oversight of that as a corporate.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Thank you so
Super
much.
interesting. That's a real, I never thought of that, honestly, because when we speak to commercial airlines and corporates, like to Eddie's point, like you said, right? The corporates is their scope 3 and the airlines is their scope 1. So someone else is scope 3, someone else is scope 1. Cool. Get that. But yeah, I didn't think that. In business aviation, obviously the company owns the jet. So now it's their scope 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to your point around like, what do you want to buy specifically? That's an interesting.
And I think we have to be, our space it's interesting because if the corporate owns their own jet, there is actually no scope 3 party, because the corporate owns the aircraft, operates it directly themselves. They're the scope 1 owner of the fuel. The person riding on the aircraft is also part of the company. So there actually is, no scope 3, at least from a business travel perspective, on that underlying scope 1. So if the SAF goes into the business aircraft in that situation, there really is no scope 3 to kind of separate from it. So I think that's where we want to be, careful, where we've been conservative to say, okay, you can't, if there's not a scope 3 that's created fundamentally, I think in the underlying, use of the fuel, then you can't take one off of the SAF as well. But I don't think we've had that definition out there at a, GHGP level yet, but that's something we want to be careful about.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think, like you said, we would need a whole nother episode to dive into all the different
For that
aspects.
accounting. Yeah.
Yeah, on SAF. But I think, shifting into, what our last segment here, and wanted to discuss a topic that is new to me, and I think is new to a lot of folks, which is contrail credits and contrail mitigation, right? And people are familiar with what contrails are. How they are the wispy white condensation trails that
Yep.
planes leave in the air. But these induce these induced clouds can trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, right? And the IPCC's report says that the contrail formed clouds account for roughly 35% of aviation's global warming impact, which is a warming effect on the same order as aviation's CO2 emissions. So it's quite significant, and we're seeing the European Commission and Eurocontrol have been working on some frameworks to measure and ultimately reduce contrail warming. But I definitely want to unpack this because there, like you said to me previously, there is an emergence of contrail credits, and this is an intriguing development and proposal to create contrail related. Is it carbon credits as part of the voluntary carbon market, or is it more related to a different? Yeah, I would love for you to unpack this.
Yeah. So we've seen proposals for both. I think both a carbon-based credit that comes from the reduction of contrails and a contrail credit that comes directly, more one-to-one for contrail side. But it gets to, I think, one of the challenges we have on the non-CO2 side. So, you pointed out a third of our emissions kind of come from contrails. There's another third kind of from nitrous oxides. So about 2/3 of our emissions are coming from non-CO2 sources. That last third just being the carbon impact. So the 2/3 of our warming impact is from these non-CO2 sources. And early on in our program, we recognized this and said we want people to understand that part of their footprint is not just the carbon. And so, our level 1 we talked about is 100% carbon neutrality. That's the beginning. Level 2 is being fully emissions neutral. So looking at all emissions, how do we offset the carbon equivalent, impact of that? Or how do we reduce or mitigate contrails? Because as you pointed out, they're a condensation trail that forms in very specific atmospheric requirements or situations. So you have to have the right humidity, the right temperature for a contrail to form at all, and then even a smaller kind of subset of conditions for that contrail to persist. And if you see a contrail that forms, it disappears a few seconds away, those aren't the really warming ones that we're concerned about. ones that persist, they grow, and they combine with other contrails. Those are the ones I think that have the biggest warming impact. And we've looked at some flights, if we look at a flight by flight analysis, the contrail impact of that flight might be 1,000 times the carbon footprint of that flight. So they're an incredibly, impactful warming impact, I think, on a flight by flight basis. Now, only about 2% of flights make contrails, so it's not something that we worry about on every single flight. And where you fly those airplanes relative to those conditions being right will affect, pretty heavily what that non-CO2 footprint might be. So Europe has been working on a few airspace trials. We've been doing trials with aircraft operators as well to say if we can forecast those regions with the right conditions for persistent contrails and fly above them or around them, we could reduce the impact of an aircraft flight 1,000 times if we reduce those kind of high impact contrails. So we've seen some emergence of same that kind of approach out there, trying to standardize it as kind of a contrail credit, but it gets quite challenging, I think, in that front, because one of the biggest questions is how do you convert that? One, how do you kind of compare one contrail to another? We've got kind of estimates of what those warming impacts are, but we're relying on upper atmosphere humidity data to tell us, how impactful a contrail might be today. And as everybody knows with the weather, it's only so accurate. So getting a really robust understanding of what the warming impact of a single contrail is a lot more challenging than looking, I think, at the industry more broadly. So one of the initiatives we've been involved with is trying to use weather cameras or ground-based cameras to actually identify contrails automatically. And instead of using weather models to predict them, use a combination of satellites and cameras to identify and monitor contrails over the regions where we know that they happen most frequently. So the Northeast US, Northern Europe, Europe in general, that's where we see these regions most frequently appear. Aircraft activity is the highest. So that's areas we want to focus on, actual monitoring of contrails so that we could get better data and better avoidance inputs, I think, into our mitigation approaches. But one of the fundamental challenges about it is a contrail, even the persistent ones, might last for 18 hours at most. That's kind of the full extent of what a contrail could be. Most are, I think, on average, 3 to 4 hours. If we talk about a persistent contrail only, 3 to 4 hours is kind of their typical lifetime. Carbon, when we emit it into the atmosphere, we're talking an average lifetime of 100 years. So it's a much different time scale to compare the warming impact of one input versus another. We often liken it to, if you think about carbon as raising the temperature inside an oven, contrail is kind of like nuking something in a microwave. So it's a much faster, much higher intensity, but shorter lived kind of warming impact. And so comparing those can be difficult. There's a few different ways. We've chosen one of the radiative forcing index to do so, but depending on the index you choose, that can vary quite widely as well. So that's where I think it will be really interesting to watch what Europe does, because long term, we think the expectation is to incorporate non-CO2 into EU ETS and having to buy allowances to cover your non-CO2 as well. But how we do that, if that's a carbon equivalent market or a non-carbon equivalent market, if it's a contrail-based credit or a carbon-based credit you use for contrails, will be really interesting. And I think Europe might be the one that defines that probably in the next 5 years or so. So something to watch, I think, as we look outward, is how non-CO2, especially within aviation, might come trickle into the carbon or regulatory carbon markets.
Mm.
Thanks for that. That's really interesting, Kennedy, because essentially you've highlighted, and look, radiative forcing has been the dirty little secret, let's just say, within the aviation kind of climate impact and weather impact for a long time, but it's been really hard to quantify, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for folks kind of listening and kind of hearing RFI for the first time, it's essentially, the concept is it's a multiplier effect with regards to the climate models and the impacts for airlines and aviation. And so so like traditional carbon accounting effectively takes a look at the CO2 emitted per liter of fuel that's burnt, and typically does that at ground level, even though the planes fly obviously at altitude.
Yep.
And it does, so it misses these contrail effects and other components. So it has this multiplier effect. And so if an airline emits, let's say 100,000 tons and an RFI of value of 2, essentially their warming impact is closer to 200,000 tons of CO2 in terms of equivalency. But to your point, they're not not all of those impacts are climate necessarily. They're more weather related, because you said that they're highly localized, one, and two, shorter lived, much shorter lived in terms of measured in hours and maybe days, but certainly not years as in the CO2 impact that's emitted. And so it's a really interesting kind of phenomena that you kind of describe. I think, like, it's great to see that there's an emergence with regards to sort of technologies and the direction to mitigate those types of impacts, right? Certainly. I question whether a market-based approach, and I'm a huge proponent of market-based approaches, right, is the most eloquent way to kind of help to curtail this. I think, though, however, some things that, like, I don't know, just scheduling and better route planning, and also modulating the different altitudes at which planes fly can mitigate those impacts. Can you elaborate on that, around how airline operators within the private sort of airline industry, and even like larger commercial airlines, are thinking about the contrail mitigation aspect as a kind of climate like lever, whether it's software or looking at humidity layers and whatever else?
Yeah, so I think you bring up a great point there. And I think this is one where actually I would agree. I don't know that a market-based approach is right for dealing with non-CO2 emissions, because they're so localized and so dependent on how an aircraft flies. Whereas, 1 metric ton of carbon kind of has the same impact of 1 metric ton of carbon, no matter where it's emitted. It doesn't have that background, impact that relies on the time of day or the season or the altitude or the background conditions, the underlying albedo of what you're flying over. All of those impact what a contrail's impact might be, or even the nitrous oxides might be. And so it's just much more difficult, I think, to create a one-to-one. And why I think I would agree with you that the operational mitigation, I think, is probably what's going to be more successful here. The ways you can avoid contrails, you can either fly around them, but usually these regions are very thin, like pancakes, and flying around them could be hundreds to thousands of miles. And so it's not very practical or fuel efficient to fly around them. Being thin, though, you could fly above or below these regions pretty easily. Now, but commercial airlines, their kind of highest altitudes they can fly at are usually within these contrail regions. So for them to avoid a contrail, it usually means flying below, and that will have a fuel burn penalty. Most of the time, it's less than 1%. So it might be within just the normal, operating kind of conditions for an aircraft, an airline. 1%, might sound like a lot, but on a given trip, you might have discrepancies, based off the winds or based off the weather conditions, or you had to hold or traffic that, would lead to that normal kind of noise. So it might be a little bit of extra fuel, but nothing outside of kind of a standard, deviation. For our operators, they can usually fly above these contrail regions. So the regions are usually, kind of within the high 30,000 feet, 33 to 41,000 feet, which is the region that most airlines are flying within. Within business aviation, we can usually fly into the 40,000s or even to 51,000 for some aircraft, which puts you well above weather in general and contrails especially. And so it's really been more of us of how do we coordinate with air traffic control to say, okay, we could fly above this region. You just have to let us, or look at the specific missions where it's possible for us to do that. And now there's not a fuel burn penalty. You're actually saving carbon and contrails. You
Let's
just have to know
drag
where those regions are. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Eddie, sorry to hijack it with the nerd questions.
No, I think it's super interesting. It's very complex. And I think, Kennedy, you've been able to dissect it like very, very well and articulate it well for our audience. So thank you very much. And, with that being said, it's been a fantastic deep dive, this episode. So we really appreciate your time. And, maybe one last final question, before we close up. What, on a forward-looking basis, like, and as someone deeply involved in the space, how do you see the broader trajectory of climate action in aviation unfolding over the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what do you hope for? What do you see in 2030? What gives you optimism, and what keeps you up at night?
It's a great question. So I think what I want us to see, or what my hope is, I think within our space, our niche, these smaller aircraft operators, we want that to be, the spearhead, I think, leading sustainability within aviation more broadly. We see operators now that we work with that are already using 100% blended SAF. So SAF, we didn't talk about it, but SAF has to be blended with normal fuel to be used in an airplane. Usually it's 30-70. Most airlines, as you talked about, are using, less than 1% or maybe even less than 0.5% of SAF today. We have operators that are using 30% effectively because they're using 100% of that blended product. We have others that are looking at how they can use 100% neat SAF from a book and claim kind of basis. So you have these high commitments from people to be using SAF. Most of our operators, we've offset, I think, about 5 million metric tons, 1.5 million flight hours are fully carbon neutral under our program since we launched. So we've seen these, climate commitments from people that have achieved what essentially is our 2050 goal today, and it's answering how can we do even better. And I think, I'm excited by, I think, the promise of electric aviation within that training market. We actually operate an electric aircraft. The first ones were certified in Europe a few years ago and recently last year within the US. And it's incredibly impressive, I think, what electric can provide within aviation. So not only do you have no emissions coming out of the back of the aircraft, the noise improvements are quite impressive, which is usually, typical complaint around airports. And so much cheaper to operate as well. So a traditional aircraft, you might be a few $100s per hour to run an airplane just from the cost of fuel. We're talking a few tens of dollars to run an electric aircraft because the electricity is so much cheaper and the electric engine is so much more efficient there. So we're really excited, I think, what electric can do for the training market to make aviation more accessible. We're excited, I think, as we look at all the new SAF approaches out there, 2030 is when we think we'll hit the limit of what HEFA and UCO can provide. So as Refuel EU jumps to the 6% requirement in 2030, we're going to need these new feedstocks and sources to provide that. And so one of the things we've been doing is investing in SAF producers that go beyond kind of what our traditional, version 1 or version 2 SAF sources might be, so that we can fill what will be, higher requirements down the road. So I think, most overall, it's going to be a long journey, I think, for aviation as a whole. We want to see, business aviation, general aviation as a leader in that piece, helping pave the way, forward, helping develop solutions for it, continuing the leadership on using climate solutions in general, being comprehensive in our approach, looking at all of this. And I think as a result, you're just going to see a lot of different parts of sustainability, I think, within aviation. It won't be just electrification. It won't just be SAF. It won't just be contrails. It's going to be all of the above, I think, in order to effectively reduce the impact from flying. But we want to keep flying and we want to do it sustainably.
I like that. And it's kind of like what you just said. It's like there's not a one size fits all, because like aviation is so different and it's not homogenous, right? So like you just kind of highlight. So it's interesting to hear that the developments across electric aviation is come on really well within am I correct? It's just more the short haul flights, like for business aviation,
2 hours,
right? Like
maybe.
a couple of hours, like a 300 kilometer sort of radius kind of flights, like 500, something like that.
Probably not even that scale yet. I mean, I think the current
scale?
aircraft we fly is maybe 50 kilometers. So,
Okay.
it's really training only at this point, and that will be the
Sure.
focus thing for a little while.
Yeah, but I think that, as battery technologies improve over time and you start getting better cells and distribution for that, I mean, there are still some physics requirements or limitations, I should say, with regards to the energy density, right? We talked about that earlier. Like, jet fuel's really dense in terms of the calorific value of the jet fuel itself, right? And so when that burns, it obviously you get more of that thrust. Like lithium ion batteries are like 50 times less in terms of density. So scaling that into commercial aviation, I think, is a tricky thing. But it's really exciting to see that those short haul flights actually have a much sort of higher emissions quotient typically, right? Because the takeoff and then the landing in a short kind of window. So replacing those actually is an easy kind of win effectively for electric aviation, it would seem.
Yeah, we think, if you look at it, so if you divide it into kind of proportion of flights, and I think it's about a third of emissions of aviation come from flights less than 2,000 kilometers, about a third or medium range, 2,000 to kind of 4,000 kilometers, and then a third of emissions from flights that are 4,000 kilometers or longer. Now, if you look at the percentage of total flights, I think it's about 50% or 40% of flights are less than 2,000 kilometers. Only 5% of flights are longer than 4,000 kilometers. So you have this very small tail of flights that does a large portion of emissions, but you have a high number of flights that does, about an equal amount of emissions. So yes, if we can electrify or find other alternative propulsion, we can do a large portion of the market from a number of flights, but we still need SAF, I think, for those longer haul flights, because those are ones that the energy density of electric just isn't there. I think a jet fuel has an energy density of about 12,000 watt hours per kilogram. If you think about the energy you can store in 1 kilogram of fuel, batteries, even kind of leading ones today are about 200 watt hours per kilogram. So it's a whole 2 orders of magnitude difference between kind of what we can do today and what jet fuel can or needs to be able to.
Yeah.
Cool. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said, Kennedy, and thank you so much. This has been a fantastic a deep dive, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights. It's really been a pleasure. So, and to our audience, thank you for tuning in to This Week in Carbon, and be sure to check out this episode and follow the show and share it with someone that's interested in carbon markets or aviation decarbonization. Until then, we'll catch you next week, and thanks for listening.